Most people believed that only Confederate documents and debt ledgers were destroyed in the 1865 fire that destroyed the Henry County Courthouse. However, among the ashes, workers discovered a closed iron chest that contained 23 pages of testimony so unsettling that the rebuilding authorities had all copies burned. According to Josiah Peaton, a courthouse clerk, who noted this in his private journal, the evidence was given by a lady known simply as the Silent Giant, a 6'7" slave woman who had not spoken a word throughout 18 years old. When a Union surgeon examined her in a contraband camp outside of Richmond on March 14, 1863, she broke her silence. 3 witnesses puked at what she whispered to him about her master and her 9 daughters, and the surgeon himself asked to be sent to frontline duty right away, rather than recording what he had heard. Her account was suppressed by the military. The surgeon passed away. 6 weeks after contracting typhoid, the woman disappeared from all official records. Nonetheless, tidbits of her narrative have persisted in secret journals, private letters, and the nightmares of those who heard it. We want to hear from you before we move on to the tale of the lady they nicknamed Big Sarah and the plantation that devoured her children. Tell us what state you are listening from in a comment after subscribing to our channel. Let's now explore the world of Greenbrier Plantation, where the only remaining form of kindness is silence. On an August morning in 1831, the lady who would later be known as Big Sarah arrived at Greenbrier Plantation in Powhatan County, Virginia. Nat Turner started his uprising 70 miles to the southeast that same week. Situated on 2,000 acres of tobacco land along the James River, Greenbrier was close enough to Richmond for its owner, Nathaniel Crowther, to be able to conduct business with the city's merchant class, but still far enough away to make it appear remote. Crowther had constructed the magnificent 3-story red brick plantation house with white columns in 1828 to fit in with the Greek Revival style that was popular among Virginia's planter class. Behind the main house was a tidy row of 12 slave huts. Between 6 and 10 persons might be housed in each structure, under conditions that were considered harsh even in 1831. In addition to the debts that had all but destroyed the family name, Crowther had inherited Greenbrier from his father in 1824. By growing tobacco and implementing what he called strategic breeding plans, he was able to partially restore the plantation's profitability by the age of 31, a strategy that was growing more popular as since 1808. The international slave trade has been formally outlawed, while the local slave trade has grown. He had no legal children after his wife Constance passed away in delivery in 1829, but he still had a plantation to manage and a reputation to repair among the Tidewater nobility. The other prisoners at Greenbrier had never seen a slave like the one who got off the wagon that August morning. She had broad shoulders, hands so big they could palm a man's head like a melon, and a height well over 6 feet. She was transported by a Charleston-based slave trader called Vernon Caldwell, who stated that she was 22 years old and had been born on a rice plantation in the low region of South Carolina. For $800, he sold her to Crowther, a substantial amount that was commensurate with her size and what Caldwell called her extraordinary breeding ability. Her name was Sarah, Caldwell stated. She had been cut off from the estate of a former owner following what Caldwell referred to as a defiant incident. Caldwell's face hardened as Crower questioned what sort of disobedience that was. All he stated was that Sarah had witnessed something happen to her mother, and that she had not spoken to anyone, black or white, since that day. Crowther looked at her hands, legs, and teeth. He possessed her. Stroll back and forth. She moved in an oddly mechanical manner, never looking at anyone. Her eyes focused on the middle distance. Crower was unconcerned by her quiet. He even seemed to like it. Crower kept the fact that he had been searching for just this type of woman a secret from Caldwell and everyone else. Crowther's obsession with improving the stock of his slave population had grown in the months following the loss of his wife. In a leather journal, he meticulously recorded physical attributes, weights, heights, and what he called reproductive capability. After reading animal husbandry treatises, he started applying the same ideas to people. He felt confident, as if he had never been questioned, that he could produce a new generation of slaves who would be more valuable, more obedient, and stronger than any previous generation. He thought Sarah would be the ideal subject for this experiment. She was tall and strong, so her kids would probably be like her. She would not sway them with tales of liberation or defiance if she remained silent. Her mechanical movements, blank countenance, and seeming brokenness all spoke to a spirit that had already been crushed. meaning she would not resist what was about to happen. With a mixture of interest and sympathy, the other slaves at Greenbrier saw Sarah's arrival. Later, Bess, an older lady who was the unofficial matriarch of the slave quarters, told another captive that she could see right away that Sarah was not feeling well. Bess would explain that it was incorrect in her soul, not in her mind. That was a look she had seen before, on those who had seen things so horrific that they were beyond description. In certain situations, remaining silent was a strength rather than a weakness. The final line of defense in a world that had already seized everything else. After initially assigning Sarah to fieldwork, Crowther moved her to a separate cabin, a tiny building that had once been used for storage, 2 weeks later, apart from the other slave quarters. He informed Virgil Stanton, the cruel overseer, that Sarah needed particular care and should not be placed on the same cruise as the other slaves. Stanton just nodded and made the arrangements, having learnt not to question his employer's stranger directions over his 3 years with Crowther. Crowther made his first trip to Sarah's cabin that September on a new moon night. He was carrying a leather strap, a bottle of whiskey, and a lantern. Even though his shirt was ripped and his knuckles were bleeding when he came out 2 hours later, he had a satisfied look on his face. The following morning, he informed Stanton that Sarah had agreed to her new position and that she would now be completely under his supervision. Her cabin was off limits to other white men. Unless specifically authorized, no other slave was allowed to talk to her. During the day, she would labor in the fields, but Crowther alone owned her nights. This meant something to the other slaves. It had happened to them before, but never with such deliberate planning. Once, during the lunch break in the fields, Bess attempted to speak to Sarah to offer some consolation or support, but Sarah just looked through her as if she were made of glass. She was completely silent. Sarah startled so hard that she dropped her water gourd when Bess touched her arm, but she didn't make a sound, not even a cry or a gasp. The earliest indications of Sarah's pregnancy appeared by December 1831. With apparent delight, Crowther noted her measurements, estimated that the child would be delivered in late spring, and noted the date in his journal. He started feeding her more effectively than the other slaves, additional meat, vegetables, and dairy products from the plantation. He told Stanton that he wanted to make sure the child would be strong and healthy. He had intentions for this child as well as for every subsequent child. Over the course of the winter, the other slaves observed Sarah's growing belly. They observed how Crowther spent a couple nights in her cabin. As though she were a valued mare in his stable, he would occasionally bring her cloth or tiny presents. They could see Sarah's silence growing, how in a body too big to conceal she roamed the globe like a ghost. When they could, several of the ladies tried to assist her by leaving extra food next to her hut and giving her a silent nod of recognition when they passed in the fields. But Sarah never answered. Her lips stayed closed as though sewed tight, and her eyes never left that far-off, inaccessible spot. Later, Bess would tell her granddaughter that she sensed a sinister presence looming over Greenbrier that winter. She claimed that the air felt heavier than it ought to. Additionally, it appeared that birds avoided the vicinity of Sarah's cabin. The Bess didn't believe in evil, the human condition that didn't require a supernatural explanation, but she didn't believe in curses or hauntings in the conventional sense. Additionally, she thought Nathaniel Crowther was creating something horrible that would not be content until it had devoured all in its path. On May 3, 1832, Sarah gave birth to her first child amid a thunderstorm so intense that the oldest slave said it was the worst they had witnessed in 20 years. The competent midwife identified patients who had given birth. Hundreds of infants on other plantations then informed Bess that the actual delivery was not noteworthy. The infant, a girl with her mother's height already apparent in her long limbs, was big and healthy. Sarah was completely silent during the labor, which upset the patients. The majority of women cried, screamed, pleaded, or cursed. Sarah didn't say a word. Her jaw was still shut as she gazed at her cabin's ceiling beams with tears running down her cheeks. Sarah would look at the newborn with an expression that patients would later describe as the saddest thing they had ever seen. Ever. When they placed the baby in her arms. Placed the baby in her arms. It was a more profound kind of grief that seemed to foresee the future, rather than the melancholy of weariness or pain. Crowther gave the kid the name Delilah, and meticulously documented her birth in his journal. 8 lb, 3 Oz, 22 lengthy. He penned, perfect specimens. Both mother and daughter. The following day, he brought a tiny silver rattle to the cabin, which seemed incredibly out of place in the room with the dirt floor. With the joy of a guy whose investment was yielding profits, he put it in the baby's hand and grinned. Sarah held her daughter close while she watched him with those vacant eyes and remained silent. Sarah was permitted to keep Delilah with her for the first year of her life. Based on his research on animal breeding, Crowther thought that the early care and milk of the mother would fortify the child's constitution. As a result of his frequent visits to Sarah's cabin, Sarah became pregnant once more by the time Delilah became 8 months old. The pattern was known. Crowther was not going to quit. In March 1833, Rebecca, the second child, was born. November of the same year saw the arrival of the third, Judith. Ruth, the fourth, arrived in July 1834. The routine was the same for every pregnancy. Sarah's stillness, Crowther's visits, the patiently attended birth, and the meticulous recording in Crowther's journal. Sarah always had that same look of unfathomable grief when she held her newborn baby. And every time she said nothing. The extent of Crowther's idea became clear to the other slaves. Unlike many slaveholders, he was not merely taking Sarah as a concubine. Every single child was a girl, and he was methodically breeding her, treating her like livestock with the express purpose of having as many children as possible. The elder slaves murmured that this was intentional rather than accidental. Because daughters could be bred in turn, Crowther desired daughters. He was creating what he referred to as his enhanced line, planning for generations to come. 6 daughters, Delilah, Rebecca, Judith, Ruth, Esther, and Naomi, were born to Sarah by 1836. They all displayed indications of the remarkable height of their mother. At 4 years old, Delilah was already around the height of a 6-year-old. Crowther was overjoyed. In order to keep a closer eye on the elder girls' growth, he had started to separate them from their mother and put them to work in the main home. In order to increase their value when the time came, he informed Stanton that he wanted them to master household skills like cooking, cleaning, and sewing. However, others who worked in the house witnessed how Crowther observed these little girls, how his gaze followed them with the same cold evaluation he had previously given to their mother. When these girls reached adolescence, the female house slaves started to worry about what would happen. As her girls grew older, Sarah's time with them decreased. Crowther had determined that if mother and children had less contact, Sarah would not be able to teach them any concepts of escape or resistance. He wanted the daughters to believe that their circumstances were normal and unavoidable. He wanted them to be as obliging and naive as their mother seemed to be. Sarah's quiet was not cooperation, and that was what Crowther did not realize because of his conceit. It was a calculation. Late in 1836, 2 things happened that would trigger the tragedy that continues to haunt Powhatan County. The first was the appointment of a new overseer by Crowther. Everyone agreed that Virgil Stanton's death in August of that year was a fitting conclusion for a nasty man, as he had been kicked in the head by a mule. Edmund Yancey, a younger guy who had just moved from North Carolina, took his post. Yancey worked effectively and cruel, yet he was also inquisitive, unlike Stanton. He took note. The tall, quiet woman in the remote cabin and the increasing number of pale-skinned girls who all looked remarkably like their lord caught his attention as he kept his own records. The 7th pregnancy that Sarah experienced was the second incident. However, this pregnancy was not like the others. She was clearly having twins at the end of her second trimester. When the cabin's medical staff examined her, they detected 2 separate heads and informed Crowther that he should anticipate having 2 more daughters by spring. Crowther was almost naive in his enthusiasm. His breeding effort was considerably more successful than he had anticipated because of the twins. He prohibited Sarah from eating and doubled her food allotment. From any fieldwork, she was worth too much now to take a chance. On March 22, 1837, Hannah and Abigail, the twins, were born. Both made it out alive. They were both female and in good health. Sarah had now given Crowther 8 daughters, ranging in age from babies Hannah and Abigail to 5-year-old Delilah. He estimated in his diary that Sarah could have at least 6 more children before the end of her fertile years, if the pattern persisted. Already he was making plans for Delilah's future. In 1839 she would turn 12. She could start having children of her own by the ages of 13 or 14. Greenbrier would become the most prosperous plantation in Powhatan County as a result of the cycle's exponential growth and the dynasty of slaves it produced. However, once the twins were delivered, Sarah had undergone a transformation. It was originally seen by patients. Sarah had never spoken. Now, however, there was passion instead of emptiness in her eyes. Her face was no longer merely dejected as she observed her newborn daughters. It was determined and concentrated. Patients noticed Sarah's jaw tighten in what appeared to be anger for the first time in 6 years. Screams came from the main house on a chilly November night in 1837, 6 months after the twins were born. After hearing Crowther yelling, the slaves in the quarters heard a big object crash. Yanzi came running toward the house from his hut, carrying a revolver. Though the official record would mention virtually nothing about it, what he saw within would become the focus of rumors and conjecture for decades to come. In a corner of Crowther's study, 5-year-old Delilah was cowering, her dress ripped. A brass candlestick that was lying on the floor had cut Crowther's head, causing him to bleed. And Sarah was standing in the doorway, silent as usual, but obstructing any escape with her enormous frame. She had a kitchen knife in her hand. Somehow she had escaped from her locked cottage, located her daughter in Crowther's study, and walked to the main house. Although the details of what she had seen were never formally documented, everyone in the room understood the consequences. Yanzi lifted his handgun and pointed it at Sarah's chest. No one moved for a long time. Then Sarah took an unprecedented action. For the first time since she had arrived at Greenbrier 6 years prior, she turned to face Crowther. Yanzi subsequently informed his wife that he felt his blood run cold when he saw the intense contempt she had for him. And then she turned and left the house with the knife still in her hand. She didn't run. She just strolled back toward her cabin, using the same automated gate. Wiping blood from his face, Crowther yelled for Yanzi to shoot him. Yanzi, however, paused. Sarah's calm, purposeful exit had unnerved him for some reason. She wasn't running away out of dread of punishment, and she was retreating like if she had achieved her goal all along. Sarah had vanished into the shadows before Yanzi could decide. The following morning, they discovered her seated in her cabin with her 9th daughter, a baby she had given birth to on her own during the night. Nobody had even been aware of her second pregnancy. The infant was little but alive, and Crowther would name her Miriam. Beside the kitchen knife purposefully set on the floor in front of her and dried blood on her thighs, Sarah sat beside her. As usual, she remained mute as she looked straight ahead, anticipating whatever would happen next. Crowther had to make a decision. Both legally and customarily, Sarah's it was a criminal penalty to attack a white man. Even if she was defending her daughter, he might sell her or have her executed. However, doing so would mean giving up his enhanced line, his breeding program, and the wealth he thought these kids held. He deliberated for a week before making his choice. Sarah would not be killed, but she would be punished. She would be confined, her cabin indefinitely, only leaving for essential upkeep. She would never again see her daughters. Additionally, Crowther had a blacksmith create an iron collar that would be permanently fastened to her neck by a chain that was fastened to her cabin's wall, guaranteeing that she would never attack anyone again. The chain was not long enough to reach the door, but it was long enough for her to navigate the cramped area. As this sentence was executed, the other slaves looked on in fear. Yanzi gave Bess 10 lashes for crying in public. It was unlawful for the house slaves who had looked after Sarah's daughters to discuss what had transpired. And Edmund Yanzi, who had noticed something in Crowther's study at that same moment that he was unable to fully describe, started keeping a covert notebook of his own, a log of observations that would come in handy years later. The punishment for Sarah started in December 1837. She remained chained like an animal in that hut for the next 4 years, only being visited by Crowther for his reasons and by patients when they needed medical attention during births. During that first year in captivity, she gave birth to her 9th daughter. Delilah was never seen by her again. None of her other children, including Rebecca and Judith, were ever held by her. She also never said a word. However, as Bess had realized years before, quiet can be a weapon, and Sarah was honing hers every day. Between 1837 and 1845, Greenbrier Plantation underwent a transformation that even nearby slaveholders found unsettling. Crowther's infatuation with his breeding program had turned into a madness that dominated his thoughts at all times. 2 of the principal rooms had been transformed by him, house into what he referred to as his study of human husbandry, supplying them with daguerreotype pictures of Sarah's girls at different ages, measurements, and charts. Though he was cautious to formulate his questions in abstract words that did not disclose the entire extent of his research, he wrote to agricultural associations and even some medical specialists. Under Crowther's careful supervision, the daughters themselves developed in their own areas. In 1845, the oldest, Delilah, turned 13, being almost 6 feet tall and possessing a remarkable look that attracted attention everywhere she went. She had inherited her mother's height. In order to satisfy his demand for social respectability, Crowther had schooled her in household administration and had started presenting her to guests as his ward, a lie that deceived no one. Only the house slaves who changed the sheets and heard the noises that reverberated through the hallways at night knew what transpired between Crowther and Delilah during their private time. In addition, Rebecca, Judith, and Ruth worked in the house, gaining knowledge that Crowther said would help them become skilled slaves. The chef was an old woman named Dinah, who treated the girls with a kindness that verged on disobedience, while Esther and Naomi, who were a little younger, assisted in the kitchen. Crowther had the youngest three, Hannah, Abigail, and Miriam, brought to the main house on a regular basis for what he called inspections, but they continued to remain in the slave quarters. Sarah stayed shackled in her hut all these years. She was seldom seen by the other slaves. It appeared that Crowther intended her existence to be hidden from view, which is why he had the windows of the cabin boarded up from the outside, ostensibly to stop her from signaling to others. Twice a day food was left at her door. There was a tiny gated area behind her cottage where she was permitted to walk once a week while still chained. The other slaves would occasionally catch a sight of her during these fleeting moments of semi-freedom. They said she was different now. All of her hair had turned gray. Despite Crowther's claims of excellent care, her body, albeit still large, had become haggard, suggesting poor nutrition. However, those who ventured to gaze into her eyes stated that they had changed completely, becoming blazing instead of vacant. Throughout these years, Edmund Yancey kept up his covert journal, recording findings that grew more and more troubling. He took note of the daughters' ages and the start time of Crowther's nighttime visits to their rooms. He captured the way Rebecca winced when Crowther touched her shoulder on her 12th birthday, and the tears he witnessed on Delilah's face at breakfast the morning after her 13th birthday. Yancey did not support abolition. He violently upheld slavery because he believed in it. However, he was disgusted by what he was seeing. Slavery existed, followed by this. He was aware of the difference as well. Reverend Thomas Sheffield, a Methodist circuit preacher, came at Greenbrier in September 1845 while making his rounds in Powhatan County. Although Crowther was not a devout man, he kept up appearances for social reasons and permitted Sheffield to give Sunday afternoon sermons to the slaves. Sheffield was a slender, driven man in his 40s, who was sincere about sharing the gospel even with slaves, in contrast to many white preachers of the time. He truly appeared to be concerned with the spiritual well-being of slaves, despite the fact that his perception of justice was constrained by the blinders of his day and location. Sheffield observed that Greenbrier had an oddly high proportion of mixed-race girls, all of whom were remarkably similar to one another. He made a remark about this to Crowther, who stated with scarcely disguised pleasure that these were the daughters of a certain slave woman who was a superb breeder. Sheffield's face grew serious. He requested permission to talk to this woman in order to offer spiritual guidance. Crowther declined, saying she was ill and couldn't have guests. Sheffield was suspicious of something about his refusal. Sheffield had a private conversation with Bess and a few of the elder slaves that night. What she told him cautiously, aware of the risk of talking too openly to any white man, and it appalled him. She made no overt reference to Crowther's sexual assault. However, she described Sarah's shackles, her loneliness, and the sadness that loomed like a mist over the estate. She said that Sarah lived in darkness, had not spoken for 14 years, and had been split up from her 9 daughters. Sheffield had enough insight to see the big picture. Before departing Greenbrier the following morning, Sheffield squared up to Crowther. For a circuit preacher with no money or influence, it was a courageous and perhaps stupid act. He informed Crowther that his actions were a disgrace to God, that no amount of property rights could excuse such abuse of a human being, and that there were boundaries that should not be violated even within the framework of slavery. With a look of icy enjoyment, Crowther listened, then told Sheffield he was not welcome at Greenbrier anymore. Crowther threatened to use his enormous influence to have Sheffield removed from the Methodist ministry, and to sue him for defamation if he made any public complaints. Angry and scared but ultimately helpless, Sheffield fled. But Sheffield took a step that would eventually prove important. Without mentioning Crowther by name, he wrote a thorough letter to his bishop outlining what he had seen at Greenbrier. Additionally, he forwarded a copy to a colleague clergyman in Richmond who had shown compassion for the more reformed aspects of the Methodist Church. These letters would be forgotten in church archives until the Civil War revived interest in them. Something changed at Sarah's cabin in December 1845. Those who continued to care for Sarah's medical needs observed it. Sarah had started making marks on the walls on a regular visit, lines grouped in fives like a prisoner counting the days. However, it appeared that these markers were not linearly counting time. Rather, they were grouped into 9 columns with a varying number of marks in each column. Upon closer inspection, she discovered with a shiver that each column represented one of Sarah's daughters. Sarah was keeping tabs on them, calculating their ages. Crowther was not informed of this discovery by the patients. However, she was unable to fall asleep that night while resting in her own bed in the slave quarters. She couldn't stop thinking about the arrangement, the systematic perfection of those marks on the wall. It had been 14 years since Sarah last spoke, yet she wasn't mentally quiet. She was recalling. She had a plan. Patience knew somehow that whatever Sarah was preparing would be awful. Greenbrier saw changes in the spring of 1846 that would hasten the impending catastrophe. Crowther is 53 years old now, older and more assured of the success of his breeding program. He made the decision to grow his business. His goal was to repeat his success with Sarah, so he bought 3 more slave women, carefully chosen for their height and physical prowess. In addition, he built 3 other cabins close to Sarah's, all of which had boarded windows, reinforced doors, iron rings set into the floor for chains, and the same isolation elements. The remaining slaves watched with increasing fear as these preparations were made. They knew that Sarah's destiny would be repeated 3 times, and they knew what Crowther wanted. Crower's confidence, however, had grown sloppy. He stayed in Richmond longer, mingling with other planters and even submitting a paper on better labor force breeding methods to an agricultural group. Something was particular enough to cause some audience members to change, yet abstract enough to be respectable, unsettled in their chairs. The day-to-day running of Greenbrier during his absences was increasingly left to Edmund Yancey, whose personal distaste for Crowther's practices had developed into something approaching a moral crisis. Yancey has never thought of himself as a good guy. In order to maintain the harsh discipline that kept the plantation operating, he had split up families, whipped slaves, and more. However, Crowther's repeated sexual abuse of Sarah and his daughters went too far, which even Yancey couldn't tolerate. Yancey did not think if Crowther had found it, that would have killed him. One afternoon, when Crowther was in Richmond, he unlocked the door to Sarah's cabin and stood at the threshold, peering inside but without going inside. With the iron collar around her neck and the chain extending to the wall, Sarah sat on her straw mattress. For a long time, none of them moved as she gazed at him with those blazing eyes. Then Yancey said something. Sarah's expression remained fixed as he stated, "I know what he has done to you. I know what he is doing to your daughters. I cannot stop him. But I want you to know that someone sees it. Someone knows." Then gradually she lifted her hand and gestured to the wall where she had made her scratches. Her 9 daughters are represented by the 9 columns. Yancey saw those marks and realized she wasn't pleading for pity. She was ensuring that he was aware of her counting, verifying. When the time came, someone would recall how many there were, how many had been stolen from her, and how many had been abused. After nodding and locking the door, Yancey left with the impression that he had just seen something that would follow him for the rest of his life. Delilah became pregnant that summer. Her age was 14. Clearly, Crowther was the father. However, he never officially recognized this. With a mixture of sympathy and dread, the house slaves observed her growing tummy, realizing that Crowther's scheme had progressed to the next stage. The second generation was currently being bred by him. Just as he had intended, his upgraded line was growing. When the elderly cook, Denina, attempted to console Delilah, the girl started crying one evening in the kitchen. She whispered through her tears that she wanted to die, that she had tried to hurl herself down the steps but Rebecca had stopped her, that she could not stand what was happening to her. Denina hugged her and said nothing because there was nothing to say. There were no words suitable to this particular form of suffering. In September, something extraordinary happened. When Josiah, a slave who worked in the stables, heard something that made him freeze, he was repairing Sarah's cabin. It was a low, worn-out voice that was distinctly human. Sarah was talking to herself, not to him, not to anyone else. Names were being recited. Like a prayer or an incantation, Delilah, Rebecca, Judith, Ruth, Esther, Naomi, Hannah, Abigail, and Miriam are repeated. Josiah informed Bess of what he had heard, but he hurriedly completed his repairs and departed silently. The blood in Bess ran cold. After 15 years of silence, Sarah was finally speaking, calling out the names of her daughters in the shadows of her jail. Something seemed to be waking up, something that waited for a very long time. October was equal parts discovery and heartbreak. 12-year-old Rebecca attempted to flee. Before slave catchers discovered her hiding in a barn, she had traveled 15 miles. As an example, Crowther had her whipped in front of all the other slaves after they brought her back to Greenbrier in shackles. In his journal, Yanzi later wrote that applying 20 lashes was the worst thing he had ever done. Through the first 10 lashes, Rebecca shouted, but for the final 10, she fell silent, her thoughts drifting to wherever people go when their bodies are no longer able to protect them. Upon its conclusion, Crowther declared that Rebecca would be sold out in a week. She was a negative influence on her sisters, he had concluded. Something unexpected happened as a result of this announcement. Delilah stood up and spoke in front of everyone, her belly now obviously bulging with Crowther's child. "You cannot sell her. She is my sister. If you do, I will stand on a street corner and tell everyone who will listen what you have done to us in Richmond," she said. The slaves remained silent. This was not how anyone addressed Crowther. Definitely not a slave, and especially not a 14-year-old girl who is pregnant. Anger made Crowther's face become purple. He took a stride toward Delilah and lifted his hand to hit her, but he halted. He lowered his hand and gazed at her growing tummy, his investment and his potential earnings. He clenched his teeth and announced that although Rebecca would not be sold, she would be left for a month in the root cellar under the kitchen, with little food or water, to think about her transgressions. Although Delilah had achieved a minor triumph, everyone in attendance knew it would not be forgotten. During that evening, Yanzi broke once more according to his own norms. Speaking through the door, he walked to Sarah's cabin and informed her of what had transpired with Rebecca and Delilah. He informed her of Delilah's pregnancy. Rebecca had attempted to flee, he informed her. He had no idea why this was what he felt he had to do. Maybe because Sarah had no other way to find out what was going on with her daughters. Maybe because he thought she should know. Or maybe because he wanted someone who could really comprehend the magnitude of what was happening. There was silence when he was done talking. Then he heard Sarah's voice for the first time from inside the cabin. Years of neglect had worn it down to a deeper level than he had anticipated. She uttered just 3 words. "I own them." A chill went through Yanzi's body. He realized that Sarah was talking about identity rather than ownership. She owned those girls. Her body was the source of them. She was experiencing the same things that were happening to them. He was convinced that something horrible was developing as he left the cabin. A storm had been building for 15 years, and that everything in its path would be destroyed when it ultimately snapped. In November 1846, it was 15 years since Sarah first arrived at Greenbrier. She had given birth to 9 daughters in those 15 years. She has hundreds of rapes under her belt. For 9 years, she had been shackled like an animal. She had seen her oldest daughter into the same nightmare as her. Additionally, she had remained silent throughout it all, not because either defeat or compliance, but from something else entirely. Something patient, something that understood the value of patience. Even anyone who are familiar with the worst periods of American history will be shocked by the way things get worse, just when we think we fully get the horror of what was happening at Greenbrier. Share this video with a buddy who likes dark mysteries if this narrative is making you shiver. Please remember to subscribe so that you don't miss any more stories like this one, and hit the like button to show your support for our material. Together, let's see what occurs when Sarah's silence is eventually broken. A son was born to Delilah on December 1st, 1846. He was nearly ecstatic because it was the first male offspring from Crowther's breeding effort. The boy was given the name Nathaniel Jr., and he declared to the future of Greenbrier was symbolized by the house slaves that this youngster represented. In his deranged thinking, having a son meant legitimacy and continuity. Even if everyone was aware of the boy's true parentage, he could still claim him as his successor. Crower was not prepared for Delilah's response to her son. Something changed in her the instant she held the baby. When the house slave noticed it, Despite her fatigue, she felt her spine straighten and her gaze harden. Upon witnessing this little son born of abuse and exploitation, she made a choice that would reverberate for months to come. She wouldn't nurse him. She turned to the wall and remained silent when Crowther insisted that she feed the child. They introduced Flora, another enslaved lady, as a wet nurse. However, everyone could sense the tension in the home as a result of Delilah rejecting her own son. Yanzi wrote in his journal that Delilah appeared to be adopting the tactful silence that her mother had used. She kept her eyes down unless she believed no one was looking, spoke only when absolutely necessary, and glided around the home like a shadow. During such vulnerable times, Yanzi noticed facial expressions that unnervingly mirrored those of Sarah. That same impression of someone counting, calculating, and waiting. That same scorching intensity. The 1847 winter was harsh. Everyone at Greenbrier was trapped for weeks at a time by the early and late arrival of snow. The darkness that had descended upon the plantation seemed to be intensified by the seclusion. In addition to checking on his children and recording their progress in his notebooks, Crowther spent more time in the main home drinking excessively and compulsively. The house slaves understood that he had started to show interest in 13-year-old Judith. The cycle kept going, growing and consuming. Something that would turn out to be pivotal occurred in February. Rebecca was found using a stolen Bible to teach some of the younger slaves to read after spending a month in the root cellar the previous fall, and emerging from the experience transformed and more resilient. In Virginia, it was against the law for slaves to be literate, and teaching them to read was viewed as a dangerous subversion. Crowther was incensed. Rebecca received 10 lashes from him this time. However, she said nothing despite the penalties. When it was done, she gave Crowther a look of such utter disdain that he really took a step back. Yanzi made his riskiest choice to date that evening. He carried a lantern to Sarah's cabin and opened the door. For the first time since her incarceration started 9 years ago, he entered. The stench was overpowering. Desperation, garbage, and an unwashed physique. With her gray hair in matted clumps and the chain fastened to her iron collar, Sarah sat in the corner. But when she raised her gaze to Yanzi, saw brilliance, drive, and purpose in him. He filled her in on everything. He told her about Rebecca's beating, about Judith's future, and about Delilah's baby. He informed her that as soon as the younger daughters reached puberty, Crowther intended to begin breeding them. He informed her that the 3 new women Crowther had bought may move into the new cabins. Though he believed she should know, he told her that the evil was growing and proliferating and that he had no idea how to stop it. Sarah was silent for a while after he was done. Then she spoke in a clear yet gruff voice. "How long until spring?" Yanzi was surprised at the question. "February," he said, "so maybe 2 months." Slowly, Sarah nodded. Then she said, "Where do they keep the keys?" Yanzi grasped her question right away. "The keys to every cabin, every chain, and every lock." He said they were hanging on a hanger behind Crowther's desk in his study. Sarah processed this knowledge, then said, "Go now. Do not come back. When it happens, say you knew nothing." Yanzi began to question what she meant, but the look in her eyes stopped him. He went back to his own chambers after locking the door behind him. He had the impression that he had just started something that could not be stopped. Greenbrier saw more activity and warmer weather in March. Crowther declared that he would be inviting nearby planters to a get-together, a social gathering in April intended to highlight his accomplishments and restore his reputation among the Tidewater elite. He desired for Greenbrier to appear wealthy, well-organized, and civilized. His house slaves were always getting ready, and he planned to show off his enhanced stock, that is, Sarah's daughters, as proof of the effectiveness of his breeding scheme. The meaning of this was clear to the daughters themselves. Their futures would be decided, and they would be paraded in front of other white males who would be judged like cattle. Unusual events started to occur throughout these preparations. The workshop's tools vanished. Unexpectedly, a piece of fence close to Sarah's cabin fell down. Nothing appeared to have been stolen, but one morning the smokehouse's lock was discovered smashed. Yanzi looked into these occurrences but was unable to determine why. He saw that the other slaves were tense, anxious, as though they were waiting for something, despite their claims of ignorance. On 15th March 1847, for what Crowther characterized as a standard medical examination, patience was summoned to Sarah's cabin. She discovered Sarah sitting peacefully on her mattress with the chain drawn next to her when patients entered the cabin. Somehow she had taken off the iron collar around her neck. The lock mechanism shattered as a result of the metal being bent and twisted by sheer effort. The patient was motionless in the doorway, gazing at the collar had left significant wounds on Sarah's neck. Patience, who was afraid but also moved by something she saw in Sarah's eyes, nodded and retreated from the cabin when Sarah told her, "Tell him nothing. Tell him I was sick and you gave me medicine. Tell him I am weak." What Patience did not tell anyone was what else they had seen in that cabin. The names of Sarah's daughters were scrawled into the wall in 9 columns, and beneath each name were a series of marks, counts of something Patience did not fully understand. Crowther, busy with his party preparations, accepted this report without question, adding that Sarah appeared to be suffering from a fever and should not be disturbed. However, the pattern was obvious. Sarah had been keeping track of her daughters' ages and menstrual cycles, and she knew exactly which of them was fertile at the moment, as well as when Crowther would probably visit their rooms. She had been recording his patterns for years, counting the days between his attacks and forecasting his movements with the precision of someone who had studied her enemy with unwavering focus. When Yancy discovered that Sarah's cabin had been entirely silent the week before Crowther's scheduled gathering, no noises emerged from within, and the food placed at her door stayed untouched. He reported this to Crowther, who appeared irritated rather than alarmed. Crowther said Sarah was probably being dramatic. He told Yancy to leave her alone until after the party since he didn't want any disturbances. But Sarah wasn't being dramatic. She was getting ready. In those days of seeming quiet, she had April 3, 1847 dawned clear and warm. She had been working patiently and methodically, gradually weakening the boards of the back wall of her cabin, testing the weight of her chain, figuring out how it could be used as a weapon, listening to the sounds of the plantation, learning the rhythms of who walked where and when, and thinking about her daughters, all 9 of them, and what she needed to do to save them from her fate. 20 planters from Powhatan and neighboring counties, along with their wives and older sons, were expected to arrive for Crowther's gathering that evening, and the plantation was bustling with last-minute preparations. Crowther had organized a sumptuous dinner, entertainment, and a tour of his facilities, where he would give a presentation on his theories on agricultural improvement, which was his euphemism for his breeding program. Slaves labored feverishly throughout the day, and Denina and her attendants prepared a lavish meal. Delilah, Rebecca, and the other older daughters were dressed in clean clothes and told to serve the guests, and Crowther reminded them repeatedly to be pleasant, to smile, to show the sophistication and docility that his program had produced. The girls went through these preparations like sleepwalkers, their faces masks of, the guests arrived in their carriages at sunset, and the air was filled with the sound of horses, laughter, and conversation. Crowther stood on the main house's front steps, exaggerating his warmth as he greeted each arrival. The party then moved inside, and soon the dining room was filled with men talking about politics, tobacco prices, and the escalating tensions over slavery. None of them realized that Sarah had completed her preparations in her cabin, removing the weakened boards from the back wall to make a gap just big enough for her enormous frame to fit through, wrapping pieces of her chain around her hands and forearms to make it both armor and a weapon, and making a decision. While dinner was being served and Crowther was standing to make a toast, Sarah came out of her cabin at exactly 8 Kai, having been thinking about what to do for 16 years, since the first night Crowther had entered her cabin with his lantern and his leather strap. She moved through the darkness with a surprising speed for someone who had been chained for 9 years, her body remembering freedom even though her mind had never forgotten imprisonment. She headed away from the main house, but toward the quarters where her youngest daughters, Hannah, Abigail, and Miriam, slept. She entered the cabin without a word, waking them by placing a hand over each girl's mouth. They did not scream when they saw her, and even after years of being apart, they recognized her as their mother with a recognition that went beyond memory. Sarah did not speak to them. She merely signaled them to follow, and they did, ascending from their beds and following her through the night as she guided them away from the plantation buildings to the tree-line that delineated the perimeter of Crowther's property, where she had them wait in the shadows before turning back toward Greenbrier. The ring of keys hanging behind Crowther's desk, as Yancy had described, was what she found when she entered the main house through the kitchen door. which had been left open because of the heat of cooking, and she moved purposefully through the corridors. The chain still wrapped around her arms, making soft clicking sounds against the walls. Witnesses knew that what happened next would carry those memories to their graves, and their testimony would become the fragmented record that survived. Taking the keys, Sarah proceeded to the bedrooms upstairs, unlocked the doors that led to the sleeping quarters of Delilah. Rebecca, Judith, Ruth, Esther, and Naomi woke each of them, put a finger to her lips to signal silence, and motioned for them to follow. The daughters, sensing instinctively that this meant either escape or death or perhaps both, followed. The sounds from the kitchen had ceased. One of the house slaves who had been serving had vanished, and only after Sarah and all 9 of her daughters had left the dining room did someone notice the silence. Without question, Sarah led them down the back stairs, through the kitchen where Danina stood motionless with a ladle in her hand, and out into the night. Angry at the disturbance, Crowther excused himself to investigate, and when he walked into the empty kitchen, his confusion turned to alarm. He called Yanzi, who hurried over with a few other white men from the party, and they searched the house, the quarters, and then, at last, someone thought to check Sarah's cabin. A hunting party swiftly formed after they discovered it empty, the back wall ripped open, and the chain coiling on the dirt floor like a shed skin. Panic swept through the crowd as crowd members yelled commands and lanterns were lit. Sarah had prepared for this as well, leading her daughters south and east toward the James River, rather than north toward freedom as the hunters had anticipated, because she knew the area from years of observing, listening, and counting. 20 armed white men on horseback were determined to capture the runaway slaves before they could reach freedom, or worse, encourage others to follow. In addition to knowing which routes would be most difficult to follow, and whether the water flowed quickly enough to conceal their scent from dogs, she also knew something else that none of the hunters had suspected. She had been corresponding with other slaves for months via patients who had been surreptitiously carrying messages without fully comprehending their meaning. As daylight arrived on April 4th, they had discovered nothing. No tracks, no trail, no indication of Sarah or her daughters, as if the earth had swallowed them whole. They rode hard through the night, screaming out threats and promises alternately, seeking in various directions. Slave catchers from 3 counties joined the search after he offered a $500 reward for information leading to the women's capture. But days and weeks went by and nothing was found. His entire breeding program, his future wealth, and his social standing all depended on finding those women. And her daughters were the focus of rumors and legends. Some claimed they survived the Underground Railroad and eventually reached freedom in Canada. Others said they perished in the wilderness because they were unable to survive without supplies. Still others suggested that Sarah killed her daughters herself, rather than allow them to be captured. A mercy killing that was both the most horrible and the most loving thing that could have happened. However, one witness saw something that pointed to a different reality. Edmund Yancey, who had joined the search party, but found himself increasingly reluctant to actually find his quarry, was riding alone along the James River on the 3rd day of searching, when he came upon a sight that would haunt him forever. On a small sandbar in the middle of the river, he saw 9 piles of stones, each pile carefully arranged, each topped with a small wooden cross made from tied sticks. The crosses were crude but deliberate. Someone had taken the time to construct markers to make graves or memorials, and there was Sarah standing in the water close to the sandbar, with only her head above the water's surface. Their gazes locked across the water, and Yancey sat on his horse without raising his weapon or calling out to the others. Yancey watched as Sarah slowly sank, vanishing beneath the brown waters of the James, and he waited for her to come back up, but she never did. The river was deep, the current was strong, and he never knew if she drowned on purpose or was just pulled under, but he knew that those 9 piles of stones stood for something. Yancey turned his horse around and rode back to Greenbrier, telling Crowther that he had seen nothing, but no trace of Sarah or her daughters was ever found. The aftermath of Sarah's escape destroyed Nathaniel Crowther more completely than any direct confrontation could have. Perhaps graves for her daughters, perhaps symbols of something else entirely. The 9 missing slave women, all daughters of the same mother and strikingly similar in appearance to their owner, were the subject of investigators' questions, exposing his breeding program. Even in a society that tolerated slavery and the sexual exploitation that frequently accompanied it, Nearby planters who had always suspected something shady about Crowther's operation now had proof of just how far he had gone. Many saw breeding as a bridge too far, and he was quickly and completely shunned by society. Families who had been at his party stopped talking to him. Business relationships dried up, and his creditors, recognizing his fragility, called in debts. In less than 6 months, Crowther was forced to. He sold Greenbrier for a small portion of its worth and relocated to Richmond, where he lived in a state of increasing squalor and paranoia. He was convinced that he saw Sarah's face in crowds and heard her footsteps at night. He died in 1852 at the age of 59, apparently from alcohol, and his obituary made no mention of any children, legal or otherwise. "I have spent 34 years trying to forget what I saw at that plantation," he wrote in his final entry, dated 3 days before his death in his private journal, which was found after his death in 1881. He left Greenbrier soon after the escape and never worked as an overseer again, moving to Charlottesville and opening a small general store. "I've failed. Every night I see a woman's face in a river, and when I wake up, I'm thankful that she managed to escape, even if it meant drowning. There are some prisons that are worse than dying. She recognized that, and I hope her daughters did as well." The fate. One of the biggest mysteries of pre-Civil War Virginia is the disappearance of Sarah's 9 daughters, who simply disappeared despite extensive searches and a reward that lasted for 5 years. No slave catchers reported captures that fit their descriptions, and neither newspaper. The historical record offers no conclusive answer. Could these references all point to Sarah's daughters having survived and made new lives for themselves? Or were they completely different people? Their similarities to Sarah's children merely coincidental. A family headed by Sarah D., age 35, colored, with 8 sisters, is listed in an 1867 census record from a small farming community in Michigan, though the surname is illabeled due to water damage. What is certain is that Greenbrier Plantation never fully recovered from the events of April 1847. Over the course of 15 years, the property changed hands 3 times, each time citing financial difficulties and an inability to maintain enslaved workers on the property. Slaves assigned to Greenbrier reported feeling watched, hearing voices at night, discovering mysterious marks scratched into walls, and seeing 9 vertical lines repeated repeatedly. Superstitious beliefs grew throughout the property, and by the time of the Civil War, Greenbrier had been essentially abandoned. Although Greenbrier was technically outside the scope of Union General Philip Sheridan's Valley Campaign, the plantation house burned in 1864. Historians speculate that the fire may have been started by Confederate deserters, while others believe that freed slaves were settling old scores. The ruin stood for decades, slowly crumbling, until the last walls fell in 1923. A historical marker erected in 1994 mentions the plantation's existence but says nothing about Sarah or her daughters. Local historians who are aware of the whole story have argued whether to push for a more comprehensive marker that tells the truth about what happened there. But to date, no agreement has been reached. Today, the location where Greenbrier once stood is an empty field, reclaimed by Virginia scrub pine and honeysuckle. Been reached. However, there is one memorial that may be regarded as unofficial and accidental. A sandbar that forms along the James River approximately 3 miles from the location of Greenbrier's former presence. And on this sandbar, visitors occasionally report discovering piles of stones arranged in groups. The stones are smooth river rocks, and the piles appear too purposefully placed to be natural formations. The river changes, and although local youths ignorant of the history occasionally topple them, the piles always reappear the following summer, rebuilt by unidentified hands. Are they the same memorial piles that Edmund Yancey witnessed in 1847? Probably not. The final word on Sarah and her daughters came from an unexpected source. In 1908, a woman named Clara Ara Pemberton donated her late father's papers to the Virginia Historical Society. It would be more than a century before anything made of stone would remain unchanged, but the piles continue to appear as if some tradition has taken hold, passed down through generations by people who may not even know why they are building monuments to 9 women who vanished into the American darkness more than 170 years ago. A single sheet, which he had apparently concealed from the military authorities, was among the papers of Josiah Peaton, the Henry County courthouse clerk who had witnessed the destruction of Sarah's testimony in 1865. It was a fragment of the original transcript, and it included Sarah's response to a question about why she had remained silent for so long. Words are what they use to lie, written in the careful handwriting of a Union Army scribe. I had nothing remained that hadn't been plagiarized or misrepresented. I therefore kept my silence as pure and sharp as a knife, until I was ready to use it to cut us both free. My quiet taught my girls that compliance is not the same as survival, that accepting does not equate to waiting, that a silent lady might still be plotting how to set fire to the world that attempted to shatter her. This riddle demonstrates that, despite our best efforts to forget them, the most heinous episodes in American history are those that only those who would prefer that their crimes go unpunished benefit from forgetting. Sarah's tale is not the only one. It stands for the experiences of many women whose names and faces have been lost to history, whose anguish was so commonplace in the framework of slavery that it hardly merited recording. How do you feel about this tale? Do you think that Sarah and her girls succeeded in reaching freedom, or did they fail in their endeavor? Post a comment below. Please hit the notification bell, subscribe, and tell a mystery-loving friend if you like this story and would like to see more horror tales like it. I'll see you in the upcoming video.